When we talk about a man ignoring you, we are not just talking about a missed text, a delayed reply, or a sudden emotional distance. We are talking about a psychological event. Ignoring is not silence. Ignoring is communication. It is a behavior rooted in power, ego, insecurity, attachment style, and sometimes emotional immaturity. To understand how to destroy his ego, we first need to understand what ego actually is, why it develops, and why ignoring someone can feel like such a powerful weapon. In psychology, the ego is not arrogance. It is a person's sense of self-importance and identity. It is the structure that protects how someone sees themselves. From early childhood, humans build an internal narrative about who they are. A boy who receives validation for strength may build an ego around dominance. A boy who feels unseen may build an ego around emotional withdrawal. Over time, experiences, cultural expectations, romantic rejections, and social conditioning shape how a man uses attention as currency. Attention becomes validation. Validation becomes identity. Identity becomes ego. When a man ignores you, it often activates a primitive psychological mechanism called power rebalancing. Human relationships operate on perceived value. When one person withdraws attention, the other person often feels a drop in perceived value. The brain interprets this as social rejection. Neurologically, social rejection activates the same pain centers as physical pain. That is why being ignored hurts so much. It is not dramatic. It is biological. Now let's go deeper. Why would a man ignore someone he is interested in? There are several psychological patterns behind this. One pattern is avoidant attachment. Men with avoidant attachment styles learned early in life that emotional closeness leads to discomfort or loss of control. When intimacy increases, they unconsciously pull away to restore emotional distance. If he was warm, attentive, and suddenly distant, it may not be about you at all. It may be about his nervous system reacting to vulnerability. Another pattern is ego validation strategy. Some men are conditioned to believe that attention equals power. By ignoring you, they test your reaction. Will you chase? Will you double text? Will you try harder? If you do, his ego receives confirmation. I matter more. I am in control. This is not always conscious manipulation. Sometimes it is a learned behavioral script shaped by peer culture, dating advice, or past experiences where indifference increased their desirability. There is also insecurity-driven ignoring. A man who feels inadequate may ignore because he assumes he will eventually be rejected. Instead of risking vulnerability, he withdraws first. Psychologically, this is preemptive rejection. He would rather ignore than feel exposed. Now, let's analyze behavior more specifically. If a man ignores your messages but remains active on social media, what does that reveal? It often signals selective attention. He wants to be seen, but does not want to engage emotionally. Suggests either low emotional investment or strategic distancing. If he ignores you after an emotionally intimate conversation, it often indicates discomfort with depth. Emotional intensity triggers withdrawal in individuals who are not comfortable processing vulnerability. If he ignores you publicly but interacts privately, though, that reveals fear of social perception. He may value your attention, but fear judgment, commitment, or accountability. On the other hand, if he completely withdraws from all platforms and social spaces, that may reflect stress, depression, or life overwhelm rather than ego games. Now, let's flip the perspective. What if he does not ignore you? What if he responds consistently, initiates conversation, and maintains presence? Psychologically, that signals emotional security and relational confidence. A secure individual does not need to manufacture distance to feel powerful. They do not rely on scarcity to increase value. Consistency reflects stability of identity. Body language also tells stories. When a man ignores you in person, notice micro-behaviors. Does he avoid eye contact completely? That can signal guilt, unresolved emotion, or suppressed attraction. Does he maintain eye contact, but withhold conversation? that suggests internal conflict? He is aware of you but choosing not to engage. Does he turn his body away physically? That indicates defensive withdrawal. Does he act overly casual? Almost exaggerated indifference? That is often compensatory behavior. The more dramatic the indifference, the more emotional energy is being suppressed. Human beings rarely feel nothing. Indifference is often a performance. Now let's address the core of this topic. People say destroy his ego. What they really mean is how to shift the power dynamic so that his sense of control is disrupted. And here is the psychological truth. Ego collapses when validation disappears. If a man ignores you to feel powerful, the worst thing you can do is chase. Chasing confirms his psychological script. The most powerful response is emotional non-reactivity. Combined with self-expansion, when you withdraw the emotional reward he expected, his ego experiences instability. His internal narrative, "she needs my attention," gets challenged. This does not mean playing games. It means reclaiming attention. Attention is psychological currency. When you redirect your attention toward growth, hobbies, social circles, invisible self-confidence, you shift perceived value. Humans are highly sensitive to social cues of status and desirability. When he sees that your emotional stability does not depend on him, disrupts the ego hierarchy he may have constructed. Let's analyze what happens internally for him. If he was ignoring to test control and you remain calm, post less about him, engage socially, and radiate grounded confidence, his brain begins to reassess. The scarcity principle activates. What was predictable is now uncertain. Uncertainty triggers curiosity. Curiosity destabilizes ego. But this strategy only works when it is authentic. If you pretend to be unaffected while obsessing internally, your micro-behaviors will leak anxiety. Subconscious, Ku's checking his status repeatedly, reacting quickly. When he returns, showing emotional relief, restore his ego position. Psychologically strong behavior looks different. It is slow response, balanced tone, neutral warmth, without overinvestment. It is emotional independence. It is not punishment. It is recalibration. Now, let's talk about the emotional consequences of being ignored. Prolonged ignoring can damage self-esteem. When someone you value withdraws, your mind searches for explanations. Was I not enough? Did I say something wrong? This rumination activates anxiety loops. Over time, repeated exposure to hot and cold behavior can create trauma bonding. Intermittent reinforcement periods of attention followed by silence actually strengthens emotional attachment. This is the same psychological mechanism that makes gambling addictive. Unpredictability increases obsession. That is why some people feel more attached to someone who ignores them than someone who treats them consistently. The brain becomes hooked on uncertainty. Long-term exposure to such dynamics can lead to lowered standards, self-doubt, emotional dependency, and decision-making distortions. Productivity decreases because mental energy is consumed by analysis. Sleep patterns can be affected. Mood becomes reactive. Relationships built on ego games lack psychological safety, and without safety, intimacy cannot grow. From a clinical perspective, psychologists analyze ignoring behavior by examining attachment history, reinforcement patterns, emotional regulation capacity, and communication style. We observe response latency, consistency of engagement, tone shifts, and contextual triggers. We ask questions like, does he withdraw during conflict? Does he reappear when he senses distance? Does he escalate attention when he feels competition? These patterns reveal whether the behavior is manipulative, avoidant, insecure, or simply disinterested. Emotional triggers are crucial. If he becomes attentive when you pull away, that indicates ego activation. If he remains indifferent regardless of your behavior, that suggests low investment. If he re-engages only when his status feels threatened, that reflects competitive ego dynamics rather than genuine emotional connection. Subconscious signs also matter. Increased story views, passive social media engagement without direct communication. Subtle jealousy displays. These behaviors signal unresolved attachment. Complete detachment with no monitoring often indicates emotional closure. But here is the deeper truth. The The real destruction of ego is not revenge. It is detachment without hostility. When you no longer seek validation from someone who uses attention as power, you remove the psychological fuel of their ego strategy. Mature men respect self-possession. Mature men feel threatened by it. Many people misunderstand power. Power in relationships is not who texts first. It is who remains emotionally stable regardless of outcome. Stability unsettles ego-driven behavior because ego thrives on reaction. Let's also address self-reflection. Sometimes a man ignores because he senses emotional pressure. Over-texting, constant reassurance seeking, or rapid emotional escalation can overwhelm someone with avoidant tendencies. In such cases, recalibration requires internal work, not external strategy. Self-awareness prevents repeating cycles. There is also the possibility that ignoring simply means disinterest. Psychologically healthy individuals do not chase someone who shows consistent non-engagement. Acceptance protects mental health. Forcing ego battles with someone who does not value you drains emotional resources in the long run. Repeatedly engaging in ego destruction tactics can harden your own heart. If you constantly operate from strategy instead of authenticity, you risk losing relational depth. Healthy relationships are built on secure attachment. It's not psychological warfare. As a psychologist and behavior analyst, I often tell people this: if you want to truly destabilize someone's ego, become so emotionally grounded that their approval is irrelevant to your self-worth. That is not performance. That is inner work. When your identity is self-generated rather than externally validated, ignoring loses its power. The most profound psychological shift happens when you stop interpreting ignoring as a reflection of your value. It is a reflection of their capacity. When you internalize that, your nervous system calms. You respond rather than react. And in that calm, you become psychologically unshakable. So if a man ignores you and you want to destroy his ego, do not attack. Do not beg. Do not perform indifference while suffering internally. Instead, master emotional regulation. Expand your life. Strengthen your social proof. Reduce availability without hostility. Mirror energy calmly. Invest where investment is. Reciprocated. Let silence meet silence without fear, because the ultimate ego disruption is this: when the person you thought would chase simply walks forward without looking back, and that is not just strategy, that is psychological evolution.